Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. In the shadowy corridors of the psyche, where illusions of control crumble and personas disintegrate, there lies a silent rupture we call ego death. It is not destruction, but transformation, a moment when the mask slips, and what remains is neither the self we performed, nor the self we feared to confront. As Carl Jung taught, it is in the confrontation with the unconscious that one truly begins the journey of becoming whole. And so if you find yourself unmotivated after ego death, perhaps you are not lost, but merely uninitiated into a deeper order of purpose. To understand motivation after ego death, we must first understand what ego death truly signifies, not just as a phrase passed around in spiritual circles, but as a profound psychic event. Ego death is not merely the loss of confidence or the fading of ambition. It is the psychological unbinding of the very structure that once held our sense of I together. In Jungian terms, the ego is the conscious identity, the center of our waking awareness. It is the one who says, I am this, I am not that. I want this, I fear that. It governs how we relate to the world, interpret our roles, and protect our place within the social order. But like any construct, it is limited. Ego death occurs when this construct dissolves, either through intentional inner work, trauma, psychedelic experience, or deep existential crisis. What collapses is the scaffolding upon which we hung our identity. We no longer know who we are, not because we have lost something external, but because the internal compass that gave us a sense of direction has stopped functioning in its old way. The ground beneath the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the world, falls away, revealing a vast, often terrifying inner space that is at once empty and alive. This dissolution can feel like madness or like floating in a void. The usual anchors of meaning, career, relationships, reputation, even personality, may feel hollow or irrelevant. This is often misunderstood as depression, but it is more accurate to call it disorientation. One has not simply lost interest in life, one has lost the orientation that once gave life its meaning. This is a critical distinction. The loss of ego is not always pathological. In many spiritual and psychological traditions, it is seen as a necessary stage of awakening, a sacred undoing that must occur before deeper integration can take place. The implications of ego death are enormous. First, it confronts us with the reality that the self we thought we were was only ever a part of a much larger whole. We are no longer the authors of our story in the old sense. We become aware that much of what we once called me was a story we inherited or constructed to protect ourselves, to fit in, to succeed, to survive. When that story dissolves, it creates space, but not yet meaning. That must come later. Ego death strips away our habitual patterns of self-justification. We can no longer rely on pride or defensiveness. We see through the false layers of our persona. We recognize the masks we wore to feel worthy or important. And this confrontation with our own psychic nakedness can feel unbearable. But from a Jungian lens, this is the threshold of transformation. The ego's collapse is not meant to annihilate us, but to prepare the psyche for something more whole. What Jung would call the emergence of the self, the totality of the conscious and unconscious mind. It is vital to emphasize that ego death is not an end state. It is a transition, a liminal space in which one stands between the old self and the not yet formed new self. In mythological terms, this is the underworld. In alchemy, it is the nigredo, the blackening stage, where matter must first rot and decompose before it can be transformed. It is a death, yes, but not without rebirth. Understanding this prepares us to rethink motivation itself. If the ego is gone, what remains to drive us? The answer, as we will discover, lies not in rebuilding the old structures, but in allowing something deeper, more authentic, and more integrated to emerge. But before we get there, we must honor this moment, the sacred unraveling of the known self, for only through such dissolution can the true self begin to speak. Psychologically, this mode of motivation is not inherently negative. It can drive discipline, perseverance, and creativity. Many people live their whole lives guided by the ego's incentives, rising through social hierarchies, accumulating knowledge, wealth, or status, all in service of this central. The problem arises when the ego is mistaken for the whole self, and its survival becomes equated with meaning itself. We begin to think we are only as valuable as our performance, or only as lovable as our appearance, or only as safe as our reputation. In this mindset, Motivation becomes a form of self-defense, an unconscious strategy to preserve a fragile structure of identity. Now, when ego death occurs, this structure collapses. The goals once deemed urgent lose their grip. The image of who we were striving to become no longer holds emotional resonance. Things that once compelled action now feel arbitrary, mechanical, or absurd. This can be deeply disorienting. A person may ask, "Why should I do anything at all?" Not out of laziness or despair, but because the internal mechanism that used to link action to value has vanished. It is not a lack of energy, it is the loss of a compass. In this gap, we begin to realize how much of our former motivation was extrinsically driven. We chased outcomes for how they made us feel about ourselves, how they shaped how others perceived us, or how they confirmed a particular narrative about our worth. With the ego dissolved, those narratives no longer function. There is no longer an ideal self we are trying to become. The treadmill has stopped, and in that stillness, the ego no longer whispers its commands: do more, be better, get ahead. Without that voice, we are forced to confront a haunting silence, a space where no identity demands to be maintained. At first, this can feel like apathy or nihilism, but it's important to understand that it is also a doorway. The absence of the ego's motivations leaves room for deeper, more authentic forces to emerge. These forces may not speak in the language of status or progress. They may not care for competition or reward. Instead, they arise from something quieter, something less concerned with image and more concerned with truth. In the vacuum left behind by ego death, we become capable of recognizing that motivation does not have to come from a desire to become someone. It can come from a desire to be. This transition requires patience and inner listening. Before ego death, we were driven by the need to fulfill a persona. After ego death, the question shifts from what must I do to be seen as worthy, to what is arising from within me now that seeks expression. This is not motivation as force, it is motivation as unfolding. As we release the ego's grip, we begin to see that action can emerge from curiosity, from compassion, from resonance with life itself. The ego wanted to build an empire. The deeper self may simply want to build a garden, write a poem, or sit quietly with another person in pain. The ego asked, "What will they think of me?" The self asks, "What feels true?" Thus, to understand motivation after ego death, we must first deconstruct what motivated us before it. Only then can we begin to glimpse the more subtle soul-aligned motivations that emerge, not from the desire to protect a self-image, but from the unfolding of the self itself. After ego death, one often enters a psychological and emotional vacuum, a kind of internal silence that feels alien, unsettling, and at times unbearable. It is the space where former meanings evaporate, where the structures that once gave direction and urgency no longer apply. This stage can be deeply disorienting, because it challenges the very scaffolding upon which one's sense of purpose and motivation once rested. The ambitions that once lit up our inner world now appear arbitrary or even absurd. The goals that once seemed so urgent now feel like echoes from someone else's life. It is not that one chooses to stop caring, but that the internal mechanism of caring has been disrupted at the root. This vacuum is not merely a lack of stimulation or activity, it is an existential stillness. It is the direct consequence of the ego's dissolution. When the ego dies, it takes with it the narrative identity it constructed, the story of who I am, what I do, and why I matter. These stories, although often limited and defensive, served as powerful engines of motivation. They were how we made sense of the world, how we measured progress, how we justified effort and struggle. When that story dies, we are left not just without goals, but without context. It is as if the page on which our life was written has been erased, and we are staring into the blankness. This blankness can quickly descend into what feels like nihilism. If the self is not real, if past goals were illusions, if identity was a mask, then what's left? Why do anything at all? This is the philosophical crisis at the heart of ego death. It is not simply sadness or confusion, it is the collapse of meaning itself. In this state, even the will to rebuild can feel like another trick of the ego. A person may wonder, am I just trying to reassemble another illusion? Is it worth it? These are not trivial questions. They are signs of genuine inner confrontation, a soul-level reckoning that few ever face directly. The key is to understand that this stage, as barren as it may seem, is fertile ground. In alchemical terms, this is the nigredo, the black phase, when the old self decomposes in the psychic darkness. It is not an error or detour, but a necessary stage in transformation. The psyche is not failing, it is clearing space. And just as a field must sometimes lie fallow for the soil to regenerate, so too must the mind and heart go silent before new values can emerge. In this silence there is no immediate answer, but there is the potential for truth. One of the greatest dangers of this stage is the impulse to escape it prematurely. The psyche, uncomfortable with the unknown, may try to latch onto a new identity, a new belief system, a new goal, anything to feel purposeful again. But such efforts often repeat the very pattern that ego death was meant to disrupt. The old ego wants to reform itself, even in the image of a spiritual self, but the deeper invitation is to wait, to endure the silence, to listen for something more authentic. It is in this waiting that the seeds of intrinsic meaning are sown. Gradually, faint stirrings emerge, an interest, a curiosity, a sense of quiet resonance. These are not driven by fear or the need to prove anything. They arise naturally, like green shoots through winter soil. You may find yourself drawn to certain questions, certain people, certain acts of creativity or service, not because you should but because something inside you responds. This is the beginning of soul motivation, not the pursuit of image or legacy, but the unfolding of something true, something uniquely yours. So the vacuum after ego death is not a void to be feared or filled, but a sacred pause in which false meaning dissolves, and true meaning begins to take shape, not as a product of effort, but as the organic result of deep inner listening. After the ego has dissolved and the old structures of identity have fallen away, a question inevitably arises: what now? In the absence of familiar narratives and ambitions, the psyche stands exposed, vulnerable and This is where the journey of individuation begins, the gradual, lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, beyond social masks, roles and ego-driven constructs. Carl Jung described individuation not as self-improvement, but as self-realization. It is not about becoming better by external standards, but about becoming whole by internal truth. At this point the psyche begins to reorganize itself, not around the ego, but around the deeper self. The self in Jungian psychology is not the ego, nor is it simply the unconscious. It is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal. It is the inner blueprint of wholeness, the center of the psyche that contains all opposites and contradictions. Where the ego sought control and separation, the self seeks integration and union. Where the ego acted out of fear of not being enough, the self moves toward authenticity, even if it defies convention. The early stages of individuation often begin in confusion. Without the clear commands of the ego, one may not know how to act, what to pursue, or even how to make decisions. This is because individuation does not operate through willpower or goal setting in the traditional sense. It begins instead through symbols, dreams, intuitions and inner promptings that bypass rational control. One might start having vivid dreams or feel drawn to forgotten interests. A sense of inner guidance emerges, not loud and commanding, but quiet and persistent. The psyche begins to reveal what has been repressed, neglected or unlived, not to overwhelm, but to integrate. The work of individuation requires deep inner listening, and a willingness to encounter parts of the self that were once disowned. This includes the shadow, those aspects we rejected or denied, as well as latent potentials we never dared to express. Motivation begins to shift from egoic striving to soulful alignment. One may feel compelled to explore certain subjects, create in new ways, or make lifestyle changes, not because it enhances status or image, but because it feels true. This truth is not always convenient, but it carries a strange sense of rightness, a kind of inner click that signals authenticity. Importantly, individuation is not about rejecting the ego altogether. The goal is not ego death, as a permanent state of dissolution, but ego transformation, a restructured ego that becomes a servant of the self rather than its master. The ego is still needed to function in the world, to organize tasks, maintain relationships, and navigate reality. But it no longer rules through fear or illusion. It no longer needs to prove its worth. Instead, it becomes a bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, a tool for expressing the self in tangible, grounded ways. As individuation deepens, motivation begins to take on a new character. It becomes less reactive and more responsive. One is no longer pulled by external demands or pushed by inner anxieties. Instead, one begins to act from a place of alignment, moving toward experiences and expressions that resonate with the deeper self. This may mean creating art, helping others, healing oneself,
or walking a path entirely unlike the one imagined before ego death, and yet this new path feels undeniably alive, even sacred. To engage in individuation is to accept that your life is not merely a project to complete or a role to perfect, but a mystery to unfold. Motivation is no longer about becoming someone in the eyes of the world, but about becoming whole in the eyes of your own soul. It is a return not to who you were, but to who you were always meant to become. As the psyche begins to stabilize after the disintegration of the ego, there emerges a subtle but powerful shift in the source of motivation. It no longer arises from competition, comparison, or the drive to fulfill societal roles. Instead, it begins to flow from something quieter, more internal, and more essential, the intrinsic movement of the soul toward meaning. This kind of motivation is not forced or fabricated. It is discovered often slowly, gently, and through repeated acts of listening. Meaning after ego death does not come in the form of a grand mission or cosmic destiny written in the sky. It arrives in small, often unexpected ways: the resonance of a certain idea, the depth of feeling in a conversation, the quiet satisfaction of doing something simply because it feels right. The person may begin to realize that meaning is not something that exists out there waiting to be found like a hidden treasure, but something that unfolds through the quality of one's presence and the authenticity of one's actions. It is less a goal and more a way of being. This is a profound change. In the ego-dominated state, motivation is tied to outcomes, achievement, recognition, security or control. But when these no longer hold the same allure or are seen as illusions altogether, the psyche begins to orient toward meaning as a process, not a product. One might start writing again, not to be published, but because the act of writing reconnects them with their inner truth. One might take care of a plant, not because it adds to their image, but because nurturing something small and alive feels. These are not acts of ambition, but acts of participation in life. This motivation can feel fragile at first. Without the ego's loud proclamations, it's easy to doubt whether it's enough. There is no one cheering, no one measuring success in numbers or titles. But if one listens carefully, one begins to notice a kind of inner alignment, a feeling that one is no longer striving to be something they are not. Instead, they are living from a place that feels grounded, sincere and undivided. This is the motivation that flows from the soul's alignment with the present moment. It is important to note that this kind of motivation does not always feel exciting or euphoric. In fact, it often feels quiet, slow and subtle, but it is steady and it deepens over time. It does not burn out in the same way as ego-driven ambition, because it is not based on lack or fear. It is based on connection to one's own inner world, to others, and to life as a whole. When one acts from this place, even the simplest task can feel infused with dignity and presence. There is no need to chase extraordinary experiences, because meaning begins to shine through the ordinary. Another key feature of this form of motivation is that it is less outcome-focused and more process. One begins to value the integrity of the act itself, rather than what it will bring. This changes everything. It allows for creativity to flow without self-judgment, for relationships to deepen without performance, and for work to become an expression of being rather than a tool of self-worth. It allows one to move through life, not as a performer seeking applause, but as a soul seeking to participate authentically in the dance of existence. This is not a passive way of living. On the contrary, it often leads to action that is deeply engaged, even courageous. But the courage does not come from the desire to dominate or win. It comes from the commitment to remain true to something within, even when it goes against the grain of societal expectations. This inner fidelity is the essence of soul-led motivation. It is not loud, but it is powerful. It does not strive to conquer the world, but to live in harmony with it. And in that harmony, one discovers not only the return of motivation, but the quiet birth of a deeper, more enduring sense of purpose. As the psyche transitions into a state of integration following ego death, the process of rebuilding identity and sustaining motivation takes on a different tone. It is not a return to the old ways, not a reassembly of the former ego or a rebranding of the self, but rather a careful, conscious weaving together of inner truths into a new, more coherent way of being. This phase is not about recapturing momentum, but about discovering a rhythm that arises from within and is in harmony with the deeper self. It is here that the individual begins to live not from performance or persona, but from presence. Rebuilding identity after ego death is not about creating a new image to present to the world. It is about allowing the self, the totality of conscious and unconscious life, to guide the shape of one's new psychological framework. The ego, which once operated as a defensive manager of identity, becomes a more flexible, transparent and integrated part of the psyche. It is no longer the ruler but the servant of something larger and wise. This new ego is no longer threatened by complexity or contradiction. It is resilient, because it no longer depends on illusion for survival. This new identity is born not of effort, but of authenticity. It emerges slowly, sometimes hesitantly, as one begins to act in ways that are consistent with the values, insights and intuitions uncovered during the collapse. You begin to know what feels aligned and what does not. You start making decisions not to reinforce an image, but to remain faithful to your evolving truth. The person you become is not a mask, but a mirror reflecting a deeper coherence between inner life and outer expression. Sustaining motivation in this phase requires new practices. Without the ego's insistent voice pushing you forward, it becomes necessary to cultivate habits that nurture inner alignment. This may include journaling, dream work, meditation, time in nature or other contemplative practices that help maintain connection with the deeper self. These practices are not performed as obligations, but as rituals, acts that center you in presence and keep you attuned to the quiet guidance of the soul. Motivation becomes less about acceleration and more about alignment. You don't move forward because you should, but because you sense it is time. It also becomes essential to remain open to the unknown. Rebuilding a self after ego death does not follow a clear blueprint. It is an emergent process, and much of it cannot be predicted or planned. New interests, talents or paths may emerge spontaneously. You might feel called to make changes that seem irrational from a conventional standpoint, but feel undeniably right on an inner level. To sustain motivation here is to trust this process, to trust that even when the way forward is not visible, you are still in movement. The path of the soul is not linear. It is cyclical, spiral, organic. Community and relationships play an important role in this state. Whereas before you may have surrounded yourself with people who validated your ego, now you are drawn to those who resonate with your inner truth. These relationships are not transactional but transformational. They support your becoming, not your image. Engaging with others who are also walking a path of integration can help sustain the motivation to stay authentic, especially when old patterns try to resurface, or when external pressures threaten your inner stability. Above all, sustaining motivation after ego death is about honoring the long arc of psychological transformation. There will still be moments of doubt, regression and uncertainty, but these are not failures. They are part of the natural rhythm of integration. You are learning to live from your center, not from fear, not from lack, but from the unfolding of presence. In this way, motivation becomes not a fuel to drive you forward, but a flame that burns quietly and steadily within, illuminating the next step, and then the next on a path that only your soul can truly see. In the aftermath of ego death, what once drove us, ambition, identity, status, validation, dissolves into silence. It is in this silence that the deeper work begins, the slow, sacred process of rediscovering what it means to live not from ego, but from essence. We move from striving to aligning, from performing to becoming. Motivation no longer comes from the need to prove or protect a self-image, but from the inner pulse of authenticity, curiosity and soul. This journey is not about bypassing suffering or skipping ahead to enlightenment. It is about walking through the darkness with open eyes, letting go of what is false, and listening for what is true. It is about letting motivation arise, not as a command from the mind, but as a quiet invitation from the self. This is not the end of life's complexity or the disappearance of difficulty. It is the beginning of a deeper participation in it. To find motivation after ego death is to trust that the destruction of the old self was not a failure, but a calling back to wholeness, to meaning, to truth. You do not need to build a new ego to replace the old one. You need only to remain present, receptive and faithful to what stirs quietly within. In doing so, you allow your life to be shaped, not by fear or image, but by the deeper intelligence of your being. And so motivation returns, not as a flame ignited by external goals, but as a steady fire that burns from within, illuminating the path of individuation, one true step at a time.